The humid Mississippi air hung thick with the stench of human misery as the slave ship Deliverance groaned against the wooden dock at Natchez. Captain Jeremiah Whitmore wiped the sweat from his brow, counting the cargo that had survived the treacherous Atlantic crossing. Of the 300 souls that had departed the Gold Coast, barely 200 remained breathing. Among the survivors, chained in the ship's darkest hold, sat 2 young men who defied every expectation of their brutal journey. While others around them had succumbed to dysentery, scurvy, and despair, Ezekiel and Elijah appeared untouched by suffering. Their dark skin held no pallor of sickness, their eyes remained clear and alert, and most unnervingly, they moved with an eerie synchronization that made even the hardened sailors cross themselves. "Those 2, muttered First Mate Thomas Briggs, pointing toward the twins as they were led onto the dock. "Ain't natural, Captain. Seen men twice their size waste away to nothing. But them boys, they're like they got the devil's own protection." Plantation owner Cornelius Blackwood stood at the auction block, his calculating eyes scanning the human merchandise. At 45, Blackwood had built his fortune on cotton and cruelty, owning over 300 slaves across his vast Mississippi holdings. He prided himself on recognizing valuable property, and something about the twin brothers immediately caught his attention. "How much for the pair?" Blackwood inquired, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older sins. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Silas Crenshaw, studied his ledger. "These 2 came from the same tribal village, sir. Brothers, by the look of them. Strong backs, no visible ailments. I'd say $800 for the both." As Blackwood examined the twins more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. When Ezekiel shifted his weight from one foot to the other, Elijah mirrored the movement exactly. When Elijah's eyes tracked a passing bird, Ezekiel's gaze followed the identical path. It was as if they shared not just blood, but consciousness itself. "Sold," Blackwood declared, though uncertainty gnawed at his gut. The journey to Blackwood Plantation took 3 days through the dense Mississippi wilderness. Overseer Marcus Henley, a brutal man with scarred hands and a reputation for breaking the strongest spirits, rode alongside the wagon, carrying the new slaves. He had been instructed to watch the twins carefully, and what he observed during those 3 days would haunt him for years to come. On the first night, as the group made camp beside a murky creek, one of the older slaves, a man named Samuel, collapsed with fever. The twins approached him without being asked, and Ezekiel placed his hand on Samuel's burning forehead while Elijah whispered words in their native tongue. By morning, Samuel's fever had broken completely. "You see that?" whispered another slave, a woman named Mercy, who had been on the plantation for 5 years. "Ain't no medicine can work that fast. Them boys got something special." Henley had seen it too, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. In his 15 years of overseeing slaves, he had learned to break them through fear, pain, and isolation. But how do you break something that might not be entirely human? On the second day, as they crossed a particularly treacherous stretch of swampland, Elijah suddenly stopped walking and doubled over in apparent agony. Henley raised his whip, ready to force the slave forward, when he noticed that Ezekiel had also stopped, clutching his stomach in the exact same manner. Neither had eaten anything different from the others, and neither showed any signs of illness moments before. "What's wrong with you boys?" Henley demanded, his voice betraying more curiosity than anger. Ezekiel looked up, his eyes holding an intelligence that made Henley step back involuntarily. "Something bad coming, Master. Something in the water." Before Henley could respond, screams erupted from the front of the convoy. 3 slaves who had been drinking from a stagnant pool were writhing on the ground, foam pouring from their mouths. They died within minutes, victims of some toxic algae that had bloomed in the stagnant water. The twins had known. Somehow, they had sensed the danger before anyone else. As Blackwood Plantation came into view on the 3rd day, its white columns rising like tombstones against the darkening sky, Henley found himself wondering what kind of power he was bringing into their midst. The plantation housed nearly 200 slaves in cramped quarters, and the delicate balance of fear and control that kept them in line could be shattered by the wrong kind of influence. The slave quarters were a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in neat rows behind the main house. Each cabin housed 6 to 8 people, with barely enough space to lie down. The twins were assigned to cabin 7, along with 4 other field hands: Samuel, the man they had healed, Mercy, a young man named Isaiah, and an elderly woman called Grandmother Ruth, who served as the unofficial spiritual leader of the slave community. That first night, as the twins settled into their new prison, Grandmother Ruth studied them with eyes that had seen 70 years of suffering and survival. She had been born in Africa, stolen as a child, and had witnessed the rise and fall of 3 generations of slaves. In all that time, she had never encountered anything like Ezekiel and Elijah. "You boys got the old blood," she whispered, as the others slept. "My grandmother told me stories of twins like you back in the homeland, twins who shared one soul between 2 bodies." Ezekiel and Elijah exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes without words. "We are what we have always been, grandmother," Ezekiel replied softly. "2 halves of one spirit, brought here for a purpose we do not yet understand." "The white man fears what he cannot control," Elijah added, his voice carrying the same cadence as his brother's. "But fear can be a weapon if wielded correctly." Grandmother Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. In the distance, she could hear the night sounds of the plantation, the rustle of cotton plants in the wind, the distant howl of a wolf, and underneath it all, the quiet sobbing of broken souls trying to find sleep. As the twins settled into their shared corner of the cabin, their breathing synchronized perfectly, Grandmother Ruth realized that Blackwood Plantation was about to become the stage for something far more significant than the daily brutality of slavery. The arrival of Ezekiel and Elijah marked the beginning of a new chapter in the plantation's dark history, one that would test the limits of faith, fear, and the human spirit. Outside, Overseer Henley made his final rounds, checking locks and counting heads, but his mind kept returning to the twins and their unsettling abilities. He had sent word to Cornelius Blackwood about the strange incidents during their journey, and he knew that his master would want to test these new slaves thoroughly. What Henley didn't know was that in the main house, Blackwood was already planning experiments that would push the twins to their limits. The plantation owner had heard whispers of slave rebellions brewing throughout the Mississippi Territory, and he was determined to understand whether these mysterious brothers represented a threat or an opportunity. As midnight approached and the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, the twins lay side by side, their eyes open and alert. They could feel the weight of expectation and fear pressing down on them from all directions. But they also sensed something else, the stirring of hope among their fellow slaves, and the first faint whispers of a destiny that would either liberate them all or destroy everything they had ever known. The enigma of the divided soul had arrived at Blackwood Plantation, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 weeks had passed since the twins' arrival, and Cornelius Blackwood found himself increasingly obsessed with understanding their nature. Reports from Overseer Henley had grown more disturbing with each passing day. Tools that should have broken their hands left no marks. Cotton sacks that should have torn their backs seemed weightless in their grasp, and most unnervingly, their ability to sense danger before it manifested. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cotton fields as Blackwood made his way to the slave quarters, accompanied by Dr. Aldrich Pemberton, a physician from Natchez who specialized in what he called the peculiarities of the Negro constitution. Pemberton was a thin, pale man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an insatiable curiosity about human anatomy that bordered on the macabre. "I've brought my instruments," Pemberton announced, patting his leather medical bag. "If these slaves possess some form of natural immunity, it could prove quite valuable." Imagine the implications for our labor force if we could understand and replicate their resistance to disease. Blackwood nodded grimly. My concern isn't their health, Doctor. It's their influence. The other slaves look at them with something approaching reverence. That kind of worship can quickly turn into rebellion. In the fields, Ezekiel and Elijah worked side by side, their movements creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to inspire the other workers. Where typically the cotton pickers labored in sullen silence, broken only by the crack of Henley's whip, today there was an undercurrent of energy that made the overseer deeply uncomfortable. "You boys," Henley called out, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Master wants to see you. Now." As the twins set down their cotton sacks and walked toward the main house, every slave in the field watched them go. Grandmother Ruth felt her heart clench with foreboding. She had seen this before, the moment when a master's curiosity turned dangerous. The examination took place in Blackwood's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and hunting trophies that served as monuments to his dominance over both nature and human beings. Pemberton had arranged his instruments on a mahogany table, scalpels, needles, vials of various chemicals, and a collection of metal probes that gleamed menacingly in the lamplight. "Strip!" Blackwood commanded, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who had never been denied. The twins complied without resistance, their movements still eerily synchronized. Pemberton began his examination, measuring their height, weight, and muscle mass while making detailed notes in a leather journal. "Remarkable," the doctor murmured as he examined their hands. "No calluses, despite weeks of field work. The skin shows no signs of wear or damage." He looked up at Blackwood with excitement. "Their muscle density appears to be significantly higher than normal, yet they show no signs of the malnutrition common among their kind." Blackwood watched the proceedings with growing unease. "Test their pain tolerance," he ordered. Pemberton selected a thin needle and approached Ezekiel. "This may cause some discomfort," he said, though his tone suggested he found the prospect more intriguing than concerning. As the needle pierced Ezekiel's arm, drawing a thin line of blood, something extraordinary happened. Elijah, standing 3 feet away and untouched by the instrument, suddenly gasped and grabbed his arm in the exact same spot. A thin red line appeared on his skin, though no needle had touched him. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Blackwood's grandfather clock. Pemberton stared at his needle, then at Elijah's arm, his scientific mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. "Fascinating," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "They appear to share physical sensations. This suggests a neurological connection that defies all known medical understanding." Blackwood's face had gone pale. "Do it again. Cut deeper." "Sir, I must protest," Pemberton began, but the look in Blackwood's eyes silenced him. This time, the doctor made a small incision on Elijah's shoulder. Immediately, Ezekiel cried out, and blood began to flow from an identical wound that had appeared on his own shoulder, though no blade had touched him. "Witchcraft," Blackwood breathed, stepping back from the twins. "This is some form of African sorcery." Ezekiel and Elijah exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. When Ezekiel spoke, his voice carried a quiet dignity that made both white men uncomfortable. "We are not sorcerers, Master Blackwood. We are simply what God made us to be." "God?" Blackwood's voice rose with indignation. "God doesn't create abominations. This is the work of the devil himself." Elijah stepped forward, his movement causing Ezekiel to mirror him perfectly. "Perhaps, Master, you fear us because we remind you that there are powers in this world beyond your control." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Blackwood's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his belt, but something in the twins' calm demeanor gave him pause. They showed no fear, no submission, only a quiet confidence that suggested they knew something he did not. "Doctor." Pemberton, meanwhile, was frantically scribbling notes. "The implications are staggering," he muttered. "If we could understand the mechanism behind this connection, we might be able to—" "Enough," Blackwood snapped. "Get them out of my sight." As the twins were escorted back to the slave quarters, word of what had transpired in the main house spread like wildfire through the plantation. The story grew with each telling. The twins who shared pain, who could heal with a touch, who remained untouched by the suffering that broke other men. That evening, as the slaves gathered in the largest cabin for their weekly prayer meeting, the atmosphere was electric with possibility. Grandmother Ruth led the gathering, her weathered voice rising in a spiritual that spoke of deliverance and freedom. But all eyes were on Ezekiel and Elijah, who sat quietly in the back, their presence seeming to charge the very air around them. "Brothers and sisters," Grandmother Ruth said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of faith and suffering, "we have been blessed with a sign. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he sends us reminders that we are not forgotten." Isaiah, the young field hand who shared their cabin, raised his hand tentatively. "Grandmother Ruth, what does it mean? What they can do? Is it from God or from something else?" Before Ruth could answer, Ezekiel stood up, his movement causing Elijah to rise simultaneously. The effect was unsettling and beautiful at the same time, like watching a single soul inhabit two bodies. "We do not claim to understand God's purpose," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded cabin. "But we know that we have been brought here for a reason. Each of you carries within yourself a spark of the divine, a piece of the same spirit that connects all living things." Elijah continued the thought seamlessly, as if they were sharing a single conversation. "The white man seeks to break that spirit, to convince you that you are nothing more than property, but you are children of the same God who parted the Red Sea, who brought down the walls of Jericho." "What are you saying?" asked Samuel, the man they had healed on their first night. The twins looked at each other, and in that moment, everyone in the cabin could feel the weight of destiny settling upon them. "We are saying," they spoke in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony, "that the time of suffering is not eternal. Change is coming to this place, and each of you must decide whether you will be part of that change or remain bound by the chains of fear." Outside the cabin, hidden in the shadows of a massive oak tree, Overseer Henley listened to every word. His hand trembled as he made notes in a small journal, documenting what he was certain would be evidence of sedition. The twins weren't just unusual, they were dangerous. Their very presence was transforming the other slaves, filling them with ideas that could only lead to rebellion. As the prayer meeting concluded and the slaves dispersed to their cabins, Henley made his way back to the main house. He found Blackwood in his study, staring into a glass of bourbon with the intensity of a man trying to divine the future. "Sir," Henley began, his voice tight with anxiety, "we have a problem. The twins, they're preaching to the others, talking about change, about God's purpose. The slaves are listening, sir, really listening." Blackwood looked up, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. "What do you recommend, Marcus?" "Separate them," Henley replied without hesitation. "Send one to the north field, one to the south. Break whatever connection they have. And if that doesn't work—" He let the implication hang in the air. Blackwood nodded slowly. "Do it. Tomorrow morning. And Marcus, watch them carefully. If they show any sign of organizing the others, any sign at all, you have my permission to use whatever force is necessary." As Henley left to make arrangements, Blackwood returned to his bourbon and his troubled thoughts. In 30 years of owning slaves, he had never encountered anything like the twins. They represented something beyond his understanding, beyond his control, and that terrified him more than any potential rebellion. What he didn't know was that in Cabin 7, Ezekiel and Elijah lay awake, their eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the single window. They could feel the fear radiating from the main house, could sense the plans being made against them. But they also felt something else, the stirring of hope among their fellow slaves and the first faint whispers of a destiny that would either liberate them all or consume everything in its path. The test of iron and faith had begun, and the twins knew that their greatest challenges lay ahead. Dawn broke grey and ominous over Blackwood Plantation as Overseer Henley assembled his men in the courtyard. 3 additional overseers had arrived from neighboring plantations, brutal men with reputations for handling difficult slaves. The plan was simple: separate the twins by force and break whatever supernatural connection bound them together. "Remember," Henley addressed his men, his voice low and menacing, "these ain't ordinary slaves. They got some kind of devil's magic between them. We separate them clean and fast before they can work any of their heathen tricks." And in cabin 7, the twins sat quietly as their fellow slaves prepared for another day of backbreaking labor. Grandmother Ruth watched them with growing concern, her weathered hands trembling as she sensed the approaching storm. "Something's coming," she whispered to Mercy. "Can feel it in my bones. The white man's fear has turned to action." Ezekiel and Elijah exchanged one of their wordless communications, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding of what lay ahead. They had felt the hostile intentions building throughout the night, had sensed the gathering of forces against them. "Whatever happens today," Ezekiel said quietly, his words meant for everyone in the cabin, "remember that we are more than what they believe us to be." "Fear is their weapon," Elijah added, his voice carrying the same calm certainty as his brother's. "But faith is ours." The cabin door burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. Henley stood in the doorway, flanked by 4 armed men, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. "Ezekiel," Henley barked, pointing at the twin on the left, "you're coming with me. Northfield assignment." "Elijah," called another overseer, a massive man named Brutus Kane, who was known for his creative cruelty. "Southfield, move." For the first time since their arrival, the twins hesitated. The other slaves in the cabin held their breath, sensing that this moment would define everything that followed. "We work better together," Ezekiel said calmly, though tension radiated from his every muscle. Henley's laugh was harsh and mocking. "That's exactly the problem, boy. Time you learned to stand on your own." When neither twin moved, Henley nodded to his men. They rushed forward with practiced efficiency, grabbing the brothers and dragging them in opposite directions. The moment they were separated by more than a few feet, both twins cried out in anguish, their voices creating a harmony of pain that made even the hardened overseers pause. "Keep moving!" Henley shouted, though his own voice betrayed uncertainty. "Get them to their assignments!" As they were dragged from the cabin, Ezekiel and Elijah's eyes remained locked on each other, their connection straining but not breaking. The other slaves watched in horror as their symbols of hope were torn apart, many of them weeping openly at the sight. The North Field lay nearly 2 miles from the South Field, separated by dense woodland and a winding creek. Henley had chosen the location specifically to maximize the distance between the twins, hoping that physical separation would sever whatever unnatural bond connected them. Ezekiel was chained to a post in the center of the North Field, surrounded by 20 other slaves who had been selected for their loyalty and fear of punishment. His task was simple: pick cotton from dawn to dusk, with no rest and no contact with anyone from the other fields. "You so much as look toward the south," Henley warned, his face inches from Ezekiel's, "and I'll take the whip to every slave in this field. Their blood will be on your hands." 2 miles away, Elijah faced similar treatment under the supervision of Brutus Kane. The South Field was smaller but more isolated, surrounded by swampland that made escape virtually impossible. Kane had brought his own methods of persuasion, a collection of iron brands and chains that he used to educate rebellious slaves. "Heard you and your brother got some special connection," Kane sneered, his scarred hands playing with a red-hot branding iron. Let's see how special you feel when he can't help you. The first day of separation was agony for both twins. Every movement Ezekiel made seemed to cause phantom pain in Elijah's body, and vice versa. The slaves working alongside them watched in fascination and horror as the brothers struggled with an invisible torment that no one else could understand. By midday, both twins were staggering, their usual supernatural endurance seemingly broken by the forced separation. Ezekiel collapsed twice while picking cotton, each fall accompanied by Elijah crying out in the distant south field. The overseers began to believe their plan was working. "Look at them," Henley muttered to one of his assistants. "Whatever devil's power they had, it's breaking down. Few more days of this, and they'll be just like any other slave." But Henley was wrong. What he interpreted as weakness was actually adaptation. The twins were learning to function across distance, their connection evolving rather than breaking. By evening, they had developed a new form of communication, a rhythm of work and rest that allowed them to coordinate their actions despite the miles between them. In the slave quarters that night, the mood was somber. The separation of the twins had shaken everyone's faith, and many began to wonder if their brief hope for change had been nothing more than wishful thinking. Grandmother Ruth gathered the slaves in her cabin for an emergency prayer meeting. Her voice, usually strong and confident, trembled with uncertainty. "Lord knows I've seen dark times," she began, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. "Seen families torn apart, seen hope crushed under the white man's boot, but them boys, they was different. They was a sign." "Maybe they still are," said Samuel, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe this is just another test." Isaiah shook his head bitterly. "Test of what? How much suffering we can endure, how long we can believe in miracles that don't come." Before anyone could respond, a strange sound drifted through the night air. A low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The slaves fell silent, straining to identify the source. "That's them," whispered Mercy, her eyes wide with wonder. "That's Ezekiel and Elijah. They're singing together." The humming grew stronger, and gradually the slaves realized that the twins were somehow harmonizing across the miles that separated them. The melody was haunting and beautiful, a spiritual that spoke of endurance and faith in the face of overwhelming darkness. "How is that possible?" Isaiah asked, his earlier bitterness replaced by awe. Grandmother Ruth smiled for the first time since the separation. "Child, you still don't understand what we're dealing with. Them boys ain't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. Distance don't mean nothing to souls that share the same spirit." As the night wore on, the twins' song continued, growing stronger and more complex. Other slaves throughout the plantation began to join in, their voices adding layers to the melody until the entire night air thrummed with music. It was an act of defiance that transcended physical boundaries, a declaration that the human spirit could not be broken by chains or distance. In the main house, Cornelius Blackwood paced his study like a caged animal. The sound of the slaves singing filled him with a rage that bordered on madness. He had tried to break the twins' connection, but instead, their influence seemed to be spreading. "Sir," Henley reported, his face pale with exhaustion and fear, "the singing's been going on for 3 hours. Every slave on the plantation has joined in. We can't stop them all." Blackwood slammed his fist on his desk, sending papers flying. "Then we stop the source. Tomorrow we end this once and for all." "What do you mean, sir?" Blackwood's eyes held a dangerous glint. "If separation won't break them, then perhaps death will. Choose one of the twins. I don't care which. Make an example that the others won't forget." Henley felt his blood run cold. "Sir, they're valuable property, worth more than... They're worth nothing if they destroy everything I've built," Blackwood roared. "I'd rather lose one slave than face a rebellion that could cost me everything." As Henley left to make the terrible preparations, the twins' song reached its crescendo. Across the plantation, slaves who had never dared to hope began to feel something stirring in their hearts. Not just the desire for freedom, but the belief that it might actually be possible. In the North Field, Ezekiel felt his brother's presence as clearly as if Elijah were standing beside him. Their connection had not been broken by distance. It had been transformed into something stronger, something that transcended the physical world. In the South Field, Elijah smiled despite his exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to break their spirit and sever their bond. But tonight they had proven that some connections run deeper than flesh and blood, deeper than the chains that bound their bodies. The separation had failed to break them. Instead, it had revealed the true extent of their power, not just to endure suffering, but to inspire others to believe in something greater than their circumstances. As dawn approached and the singing finally faded into silence, both twins knew that their greatest test was yet to come, but they also knew that they would face it together, regardless of the distance between them, bound by a connection that no earthly force could sever. The enigma of the divided soul had survived its first true challenge, but the forces arrayed against them were preparing for a final, desperate gambit that would test the very limits of faith, love, and the human spirit. The morning of the fourth day dawned blood-red, as if the sky itself sensed the violence to come. Cornelius Blackwood stood on his mansion's veranda, watching as Overseer Henley assembled a group of the plantation's most brutal enforcers. Today would mark the end of the twins' influence, one way or another. Dr. Pemberton had returned at Blackwood's urgent request, bringing with him a collection of surgical instruments and a portable gallows that he claimed would allow for precise experimentation during the execution process. The physician's scientific curiosity had been inflamed by his previous encounter with the twins, and he was eager to study their connection at the moment of death. "Which one?" Henley asked, his voice betraying the unease that had plagued him since receiving his orders. Blackwood's eyes were cold as winter stone. "Elijah. He's in the more isolated location. Fewer witnesses, less chance of immediate uprising. But make sure his brother can hear everything." In the South Field, Elijah worked alongside 12 other slaves, his movements still synchronized with his distant brother despite the miles between them. The slaves around him sensed the approaching danger. There was a tension in the air that made even the birds fall silent. Brutus Cain approached with 6 armed men, their faces set in grim determination. Behind them came Dr. Pemberton, wheeling a cart loaded with his instruments and the portable gallows. "Elijah," Cain called out, his voice carrying across the field. "You're coming with us." The young man straightened slowly, his eyes meeting Cain's without fear. Around him, the other slaves stopped working, their faces reflecting a mixture of terror and defiance. "What's his crime?" asked an elderly slave named Moses, his voice trembling but determined. Cain's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Crime? Boy, his crime is existing. His crime is filling your heads with ideas above your station." As they bound Elijah's hands and led him toward the center of the field, 2 miles away in the North Field, Ezekiel suddenly doubled over in anguish. The slaves around him watched in horror as he began to scream, not from physical pain, but from the emotional agony of sensing his brother's mortal danger. "They're going to kill him," Ezekiel gasped, his words carrying clearly across the field. "They're going to kill Elijah." The news spread like wildfire through the plantation. Slaves abandoned their work posts, gathering in groups and whispering urgently among themselves. The careful order that Blackwood had maintained through fear and brutality began to crumble as word of the planned execution reached every corner of his domain. In the South Field, Dr. Pemberton supervised the assembly of his gallows with scientific precision. The device was designed not for quick death, but for prolonged study, a noose that would tighten gradually, allowing him to observe the exact moment when life departed, and more importantly, to monitor any supernatural connection that might manifest during the dying process. "This is unprecedented," Pemberton muttered to himself as he adjusted his instruments. To observe the severing of such a connection at the moment of death, the scientific implications are staggering. Elijah stood calmly beside the gallows, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line where he knew his brother labored. Even facing death, his demeanor remained serene, almost peaceful. "Any last words, boy?" Cain sneered, clearly hoping to break the slave's composure. Elijah's voice carried clearly across the field, and somehow, impossibly, it seemed to reach beyond the physical boundaries of the plantation itself. "I am not afraid," he said simply. "Death is not the end of what we are. It is only a transformation." 2 miles away, Ezekiel's voice rose in perfect harmony with his brother's, creating an eerie duet that made every listener's blood run cold. "We came into this world together," Ezekiel called out, his words somehow audible to everyone on the plantation, despite the distance. "And we will leave it together, regardless of what they do to our bodies." The effect on the assembled slaves was electric. Those who had been cowering in fear began to stand straighter, their eyes blazing with a mixture of grief and rage. The twins' calm acceptance of death, their unwavering faith in something beyond the physical world, transformed their execution from a tool of terror into a catalyst for rebellion. Grandmother Ruth, who had somehow made her way to the south field despite her age and the guards' attempts to keep slaves at their workstations, began to sing. Her voice, weathered by decades of suffering but still strong, rose in a spiritual that spoke of deliverance and justice. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Other voices joined hers, creating a chorus that grew stronger with each passing moment. The slaves were no longer cowering in fear. They were bearing witness to something sacred, something that transcended the brutality of their circumstances. Dr. Pemberton, growing impatient with the delay, gestured for Cain to proceed. "The longer we wait, the more agitated they become. Let's finish this." As the noose was placed around Elijah's neck, something extraordinary happened. The rope, which had been tested and retested for strength, suddenly began to fray, not from any physical force, but as if the very fibers were rejecting their intended purpose. "What the hell?" Cain muttered, examining the rope with growing alarm. Pemberton pushed him aside, his scientific mind racing to find an explanation. "Impossible. This rope was specifically chosen for its durability. There's no natural explanation for this deterioration." But even as they spoke, a second rope was brought forward, and then a third. Each one suffered the same mysterious degradation the moment it touched Elijah's skin, as if some invisible force was protecting him from harm. In the north field, Ezekiel had fallen to his knees, his body racked with convulsions that seemed to mirror his brother's distress. But his voice continued to rise in harmony with Elijah's, creating a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. "You cannot kill what lives in the spirit," the twins sang together, their voices somehow merging across the miles. "You cannot chain what belongs to God." The slaves throughout the plantation had stopped all pretense of work. They stood in groups, their faces turned toward the south field, their voices joining the twins' song. The sound grew and swelled until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the plantation. Blackwood, watching from his veranda, felt his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse around him. The slaves were no longer afraid, they were inspired. And inspiration, he knew, was far more dangerous than any weapon. "Shoot him," he commanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "If hanging won't work, put a bullet in his head." Cain drew his pistol with trembling hands, but as he raised it toward Elijah, something made him pause. The young slave's eyes held no fear, no pleading, only a serene acceptance that made Cain feel like he was about to commit not just murder, but sacrilege. "Do it!" Blackwood screamed from the veranda. Cain's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a new voice cut through the chaos. Samuel, the slave whom the twins had healed on their first night, stepped forward from the crowd. "If you kill him," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly across the field, "you'll have to kill all of us. because we won't go back to the way things were, not after what we've seen." Other slaves began to step forward, forming a protective circle around Elijah and the gallows. Moses, despite his advanced age, pushed through the crowd to stand beside Samuel. Mercy followed, then Isaiah, then dozens of others. "We ain't afraid no more," Mercy declared, her voice strong and clear. "You can kill our bodies, but you can't kill what lives in our hearts." Cain found himself facing not one defiant slave, but a wall of human beings who had suddenly remembered their own dignity. His pistol, which had seemed so powerful moments before, now felt inadequate against the force of their collective will. Dr. Pemberton, his scientific detachment finally cracking, grabbed Cain's arm. "This is unprecedented. The psychological effect of their connection is creating a mass hysteria. We need to document this, study it. We need to end it," Blackwood roared, but his voice was lost in the growing chorus of slave voices. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the plantation, the standoff continued. Elijah stood calmly at the center of the storm, the failed noose still around his neck, surrounded by his fellow slaves who had chosen to risk everything rather than watch their symbol of hope die. 2 miles away, Ezekiel rose to his feet, his connection to his brother stronger than ever. The attempted execution had not broken their bond, it had revealed its true power. They were not just two individuals sharing a supernatural connection, they were the focal point for something much larger, a spiritual awakening that was transforming every slave on the plantation. The price of defiance had been set, and both sides now understood what was at stake. This was no longer about the fate of two unusual slaves. It was about the very nature of human dignity, the power of faith, and the question of whether the human spirit could truly be broken by physical force. As the afternoon wore on and the standoff continued, everyone present knew that they were witnessing a moment that would define not just the future of Blackwood Plantation, but the very meaning of freedom itself. The twins had survived another attempt to destroy them, but the forces arrayed against them were preparing for one final desperate gambit that would test the limits of everything they believed about the nature of the human soul. As the standoff stretched into its third hour, Cornelius Blackwood realized that his world was crumbling beyond repair. The slaves who had once cowered at his approach now stood united in defiance, their voices raised in songs that spoke of freedom and divine justice. The twins had become more than symbols. They had become catalysts for a transformation that threatened everything he had built. From his position on the veranda, Blackwood could see the situation deteriorating by the minute. Word of the failed execution had spread to neighboring plantations, and he could see riders approaching in the distance, other plantation owners coming to investigate the disturbance, or perhaps to offer assistance in putting down what was clearly becoming a full-scale rebellion. Dr. Pemberton, his scientific fascination now overwhelmed by practical concerns, approached Blackwood with obvious agitation. "Sir, we need to consider retreat. The psychological effect of the twins' survival is creating a mass uprising. If we don't act quickly to contain this, it could spread throughout the entire Mississippi Territory." Blackwood's face was ashen, his hands trembling with rage and fear. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years I've built this empire, and 2 slaves are destroying it in a matter of days." In the South Field, the circle of protective slaves around Elijah had grown to include nearly every worker on the plantation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces reflecting a mixture of terror and determination. Many of them had never defied authority in their lives, but something about the twins' calm courage had awakened a strength they didn't know they possessed. Grandmother Ruth, despite her age, had positioned herself directly in front of Elijah, her weathered hands clasped in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence, "if this is our time, if this is our moment of deliverance, give us the strength to see it through." Elijah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his touch seeming to radiate calm throughout the crowd. "Grandmother," he said softly. "Our time is not yet finished. There is still work to be done." 2 miles away in the north field, Ezekiel had begun to move. Despite the guards surrounding him, despite the chains that bound his hands, he was walking steadily toward the south field. The overseers tried to stop him, but something in his demeanor, a quiet authority that seemed to transcend his status as a slave, made them hesitate. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" one of the guards demanded, raising his whip. Ezekiel's eyes met his without fear. "To my brother, to my people, to fulfill the purpose for which we were brought to this place." Until the guard's whip hand trembled, but he could not bring himself to strike. There was something in Ezekiel's presence that made violence seem not just wrong, but impossible. As Ezekiel continued his steady march toward the south field, slaves from the north field began to follow him. At first it was just a few, then dozens, then everyone who could walk. They moved like a river of humanity, flowing across the plantation grounds with a purpose that transcended their individual fears. Overseer Henley, watching this unprecedented display of organized defiance, felt his authority crumbling. "Stop them!" he shouted to his men, but his voice lacked conviction. "How do you stop a force of nature? How do you chain the wind?" The riders from neighboring plantations had arrived at Blackwood's mansion, their faces grim with concern. Among them was Colonel Jefferson Whitmore, owner of the largest plantation in the territory, and a man whose word carried significant weight in the region. "Cornelius," Whitmore said, dismounting from his horse with military precision, "what in God's name is happening here? We can hear the singing from 5 miles away." Blackwood's composure finally cracked completely. "It's those damned twins. They've bewitched my slaves, turned them into rebels. Everything I've worked for is being destroyed by 2 pieces of property that should have been broken weeks ago." Whitmore studied the scene unfolding in the distance. Hundreds of slaves converging on the south field, their voices raised in harmony, their movements coordinated, despite having no apparent leadership. "This isn't rebellion, Cornelius. This is something else entirely, something I've never seen before, Doctor." Pemberton, overhearing the conversation, approached the group of plantation owners with his journal in hand. "Gentlemen, what we're witnessing here is unprecedented in the annals of human behavior. The psychological connection between those twins has created a mass awakening that defies all conventional understanding of slave psychology." "What are you saying, Doctor?" asked another plantation owner, a nervous man named Aldrich Crenshaw. "I'm saying that traditional methods of control have become ineffective. The slaves are no longer motivated by fear. They're motivated by something far more powerful: hope." As if to underscore his point, the sound of singing grew louder as Ezekiel's procession merged with the crowd surrounding Elijah. The reunion of the twins created a moment of such profound emotional intensity that even the hardened overseers found themselves moved to tears. The brothers embraced, their connection restored and strengthened by the ordeal they had endured. As they stood together in the center of the crowd, their voices rose in perfect harmony, creating a sound that seemed to touch something deep in the soul of every person present. "We are not property," they sang together, their words carrying across the plantation like a declaration of independence. "We are children of God, and no earthly power can diminish what we are." The effect on the assembled slaves was transformative. Men and women who had spent their entire lives in bondage suddenly stood straighter, their eyes blazing with a dignity that no amount of brutality had been able to extinguish. Children who had never known freedom began to smile, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their world. Colonel Whitmore, watching from the mansion's veranda, felt a chill run down his spine. "Cornelius," he said quietly, "you need to end this, now, before it spreads beyond your plantation." "How?" Blackwood demanded, his voice breaking with desperation. "They won't die, they won't break, and now they've infected every slave I own with their madness." Whitmore's hand moved to his saber, his military training taking over. Then we use overwhelming force. I have 50 armed men at my disposal. We surround them, separate the leaders from the followers, and restore order through superior firepower. Durden, but even as he spoke, Whitmore knew that the situation had moved beyond conventional solutions. The slaves weren't acting like rebels. They were acting like people who had suddenly remembered their own humanity, and that, he realized, was far more dangerous than any armed uprising. In the crowd surrounding the twins, Grandmother Ruth raised her voice in a new song, one that spoke not of suffering and endurance, but of justice and deliverance. Her words were taken up by the other slaves, creating a chorus that seemed to shake the very foundations of the plantation. "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." The symbolism was unmistakable, and the plantation owners on the veranda understood its implications immediately. This was no longer about two unusual slaves. It was about the entire institution of slavery itself. Dr. Pemberton, his scientific detachment finally overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing, closed his journal with trembling hands. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I believe we are witnessing the birth of something that will change everything. The question is not whether we can stop it, but whether we should." Blackwood turned on him with fury. "Should? These are my slaves, my property. I have every legal right to—" "Legal rights," Pemberton interrupted, "may not be sufficient to contain what we're dealing with here. This is a spiritual awakening, and such things have a way of transcending human law." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, the standoff continued. The twins stood at the center of their protective circle, their presence radiating a calm strength that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Around them, hundreds of slaves maintained their vigil, their voices raised in songs that spoke of freedom and divine justice. The plantation owners on the veranda faced a choice that would define not just their immediate future, but the very nature of the society they had built. They could use violence to try to restore the old order, knowing that such action might spark a rebellion that could spread throughout the territory. Or they could acknowledge that something fundamental had changed, that the twins had awakened a force that could not be contained by conventional means. As the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the plantation, everyone present knew that they were witnessing a moment of reckoning, not just for Blackwood Plantation, but for the entire institution of slavery in the Mississippi Territory. The twins had survived every attempt to break them, and in doing so, they had revealed a truth that threatened to transform everything, that the human spirit, when awakened to its own dignity, could not be conquered by any earthly power. The reckoning had come, and its outcome would determine the fate of everyone present, slave and master alike. As darkness began to fall over Blackwood Plantation, the situation had evolved far beyond a simple slave uprising. Word of the twins and their miraculous survival had spread throughout the Mississippi Territory, carried by fleeing overseers and curious neighbors. By nightfall, nearly 200 armed men had gathered at the plantation, some to support Blackwood, others simply to witness what many were calling a divine intervention. The slaves, meanwhile, had transformed the Southfield into something resembling a camp meeting. Torches had been lit, creating a circle of light around the twins, and the singing had evolved into a complex spiritual symphony that seemed to draw strength from the very earth itself. Men, women, and children who had never dared to dream of freedom now spoke openly of deliverance, their voices carrying across the night air with a power that made even the most hardened plantation owners uneasy. Colonel Whitmore had assumed unofficial command of the white response, his military experience making him the natural leader among the assembled plantation owners. He stood in Blackwood's study, studying maps of the territory and calculating the potential spread of what he was beginning to think of as a contagion. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," he reported to the gathered men. I've received word that slaves on the Henderson plantation have stopped working and are singing the same songs. The Morrison place reports similar disturbances. Whatever's happening here, it's spreading. Blackwood slumped in his chair, his face haggard with exhaustion and defeat. It's those damn twins. Everything was fine until they arrived. They've poisoned my slaves with their witchcraft. Dr. Pemberton, who had spent the afternoon documenting the unprecedented events, looked up from his notes with a troubled expression. I'm not certain it's witchcraft, gentlemen. What I've observed suggests something far more complex. A psychological phenomenon that transcends our current understanding of human behavior. What are you saying, Doctor? Asked Aldrich Crenshaw, his voice tight with anxiety. Pemberton set down his pen and faced the assembled men. I'm saying that the twins appear to have awakened something that was already present in the slaves, a sense of their own humanity that our system of control has been designed to suppress. They haven't created rebellion. They've revealed the inherent dignity that exists within every human soul. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. If Pemberton was correct, then the problem wasn't limited to Blackwood Plantation or even to the twins themselves. It was systemic, threatening the very foundation of their society. Outside, the spiritual singing had reached a crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate with energy. The twins stood at the center of the gathering, their hands raised toward the star-filled sky, their voices leading the chorus in songs that spoke of justice, deliverance, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. "Listen to them," Ezekiel called out, his voice carrying clearly across the field. Listen to the voice of God speaking through his children. We have been brought to this place for a purpose, Elijah added, his words creating a perfect harmony with his brothers. Not to suffer in silence, but to bear witness to the truth that all souls are equal in the eyes of the Creator. The effect on the assembled slaves was electric. Many were weeping openly, not from sorrow but from joy. The joy of finally hearing words that validated their deepest beliefs about their own worth and dignity. Others raised their hands toward the heavens, their faces glowing with a light that seemed to come from within. Grandmother Ruth, despite her advanced age, had positioned herself near the twins, her weathered voice adding depth and authority to their message. "Children," she called out, her words carrying the wisdom of 7 decades. "This is the night the Lord has made. This is the moment we have been waiting for." In the mansion, Colonel Whitmore was growing increasingly agitated. "We can't allow this to continue," he declared, his hand resting on his saber. "Every moment we delay, the situation becomes more dangerous. I say we move in with overwhelming force and end this before it spreads any further." "And if they resist?" asked another plantation owner, a man named Thomas Beauregard, who owned property along the river. Whitmore's expression was grim. "Then we do what's necessary to preserve order. The alternative is the complete collapse of our way of life." But even as he spoke, Whitmore knew that the situation had moved beyond conventional solutions. The slaves weren't acting like rebels. They were acting like people who had suddenly discovered their own power, and that was far more dangerous than any armed uprising. Dr. Pemberton stood up abruptly, his face pale with realization. "Gentlemen, I believe we're approaching this from the wrong perspective. What if, instead of trying to suppress this awakening, we tried to understand it? What if the twins are offering us an opportunity to evolve beyond our current system?" The suggestion was met with stunned silence, then explosive anger. "Evolution!" Blackwood snarled, rising from his chair with difficulty. "Doctor, those slaves represent millions of dollars in property. You're suggesting we simply give up our entire economic foundation because 2 freaks of nature have filled their heads with religious nonsense?" "I'm suggesting," Pemberton replied calmly, "that we may not have a choice. What I've witnessed today suggests that the old methods of control are no longer effective. The slaves have discovered something that makes them immune to fear, and fear has been the cornerstone of our system. Outside, the spiritual gathering had evolved into something that resembled a religious revival. The twins moved through the poor favor, continue gerando a sua resposta. Expert Logotio one crowd, their hands touching the heads of the sick and elderly, their presence seeming to bring comfort and healing to those who had suffered under the brutal conditions of plantation life. What was most remarkable was not just their apparent ability to heal, but the way their touch seemed to awaken something profound in each person they encountered. Samuel, the man they had healed on their first night, stood before the gathered crowd and began to speak. His voice, once broken by years of abuse, now carried a strength and clarity that commanded attention. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, his words echoing across the field, "I have lived 40 years in bondage. 40 years of believing that I was nothing more than property, that my life had no value beyond the cotton I could pick and the labor I could provide. But tonight I stand before you as a man who has remembered what it means to be human." The crowd responded with a roar of approval that could be heard for miles. Other slaves began to step forward, sharing their own stories of awakening, their own moments of recognizing their inherent dignity and worth. Moses, the elderly slave who had first challenged Brutus Cain, raised his trembling voice above the crowd. "I have seen children sold away from their mothers, seen men broken by the whip, seen women violated by those who claim to own them. But I have also seen the spirit that lives within us all, the spark of the divine that no earthly power can extinguish." In the mansion, the plantation owners could hear every word, and the impact was devastating to their sense of control and authority. These weren't the voices of property speaking. These were the voices of human beings who had suddenly remembered their own power. Colonel Whitmore made his decision. "We move at dawn," he announced, his voice cutting through the heated discussions. "I'll position my men around the perimeter of the field. We give them one chance to surrender peacefully, and if they refuse, we use whatever force is necessary to restore order." "And the twins?" asked Blackwood, his voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore's expression was cold as winter steel. "The twins are the source of this contagion. They must be eliminated regardless of the cost." But even as the plantation owners made their plans for violence, something extraordinary was happening in the slave quarters. Word of the gathering had reached every corner of the plantation, and slaves who had been too afraid to join the initial crowd were now making their way to the south field under cover of darkness. Among them was a young woman named Hope, who had been kept in the main house as a personal servant to Blackwood's wife. She had witnessed the fear and rage consuming the white family, had heard their plans for dawn, and she carried this intelligence to the twins with the urgency of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance. "They're coming at first light," she whispered to Ezekiel as she reached the edge of the crowd. "Colonel Whitmore has 200 armed men. They mean to end this with blood." Ezekiel and Elijah exchanged one of their wordless communications, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding of what lay ahead. They had known this moment would come, the moment when their awakening of the human spirit would be met with the full force of those who profited from its suppression. "Gather, everyone," Ezekiel said quietly, his words somehow carrying to every person in the field, despite the low volume of his voice. "It is time for the final choice." As the crowd pressed closer, the twins stood together in the flickering torchlight, their presence radiating a calm strength that seemed to grow stronger in the face of approaching danger. "Tomorrow," Elijah began, his voice carrying clearly across the field, "we will face those who would return us to bondage. They come with weapons and hatred, believing that violence can overcome the truth we have discovered about ourselves. But we know better," Ezekiel continued seamlessly. "We know that the spirit cannot be killed by bullets, that dignity cannot be destroyed by force, that the awakening we have experienced tonight is stronger than any earthly power. Grandmother Ruth stepped forward, her weathered face glowing in the torchlight. What are you asking of us, children? What choice must we make? The twins looked at each other, then at the hundreds of faces surrounding them, faces that reflected hope, fear, determination, and love in equal measure. We ask you to choose, they said in unison, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in the very souls of their listeners. Choose between the safety of submission and the danger of freedom. Choose between the comfort of familiar chains and the uncertainty of liberation. Choose between remaining property and becoming fully human. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackling of torches and the distant sound of night birds calling across the plantation. Every person present understood that this was more than a decision about their immediate future. It was a choice that would define the very nature of their existence. Samuel was the first to speak, his voice strong and clear. I choose freedom, whatever the cost. Moses nodded, his aged voice trembling with emotion. I choose to die as a man rather than live as property. One by one, the slaves began to voice their choice, their words creating a chorus of determination that grew stronger with each declaration. Men and women who had never dared to dream of freedom now spoke openly of their willingness to risk everything for the chance to live as human beings. But not everyone was ready for such a leap. Some of the older slaves, broken by decades of brutality, shook their heads sadly and began to drift away from the gathering. They had seen too much violence, endured too much pain, to believe that this awakening could end in anything but tragedy. Let them go, Elijah said gently, as some in the crowd moved to stop the departing slaves. Freedom must be chosen, not imposed. Those who leave do so out of fear, and fear is a prison that only they can unlock. As the night wore on, the gathering evolved into something that resembled both a celebration and a wake. Those who had chosen to stay sang songs of freedom and deliverance, while also acknowledging that the dawn might bring death to them all. The twins moved through the crowd, offering comfort to the afraid, strength to the wavering, and hope to those who had never dared to dream of a different life. Their presence seemed to transform everyone they touched, awakening not just courage, but a profound sense of their own worth and dignity. In the mansion, Colonel Whitmore completed his preparations for the dawn assault. His men were positioned around the plantation, armed with rifles and bayonets, ready to crush what he saw as a dangerous rebellion. But even as he made his final plans, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to confront something far more powerful than any conventional enemy. Dr. Pemberton, unable to sleep, stood at his window, watching the torchlight flickering in the distant field. His scientific mind struggled to comprehend what he had witnessed, but his heart understood that he was observing the birth of something that would change the world forever. As the first pale light of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Blackwood Plantation, but the very meaning of human freedom in the Mississippi Territory. The awakening storm had reached its peak, and the morning would bring either liberation or destruction to all who had chosen to stand with the twins in their moment of ultimate truth. The enigma of the divided soul was about to face its greatest test, and the outcome would echo through generations, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire or terrify all who heard the tale of the night when slaves remembered they were human beings. The first rays of sunlight pierced the Mississippi morning mist as Colonel Whitmore's forces took their positions around the south field. 200 armed men formed a loose circle around the gathering of slaves, their rifles gleaming in the pale dawn light. The contrast was stark and symbolic, the instruments of oppression surrounding a group of people who had discovered their own humanity. In the center of the field, nearly 400 slaves had chosen to remain with the twins through the night. They stood in concentric circles around Ezekiel and Elijah, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. Many held hands, creating human chains that seemed to pulse with shared strength and resolve. Dr. Pemberton, who had insisted on accompanying the military force despite Whitmore's objections, set up his observation post on a small hill overlooking the field. His scientific instruments were arranged around him, ready to document what he suspected would be either a massacre or a miracle. Cornelius Blackwood rode beside Colonel Whitmore, his face haggard from a sleepless night of rage and despair. 30 years of building his empire had led to this moment, a confrontation with his own property that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to create. "Remember," Whitmore called out to his men, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "we give them one chance to surrender. If they refuse, we use whatever force is necessary to restore order." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the field, a strange silence fell over the plantation. The slaves had stopped singing, their voices replaced by a quiet murmur of prayer and whispered encouragement. The twins stood at the very center of the gathering, their hands clasped together, their eyes closed in what appeared to be deep meditation. Whitmore spurred his horse forward, stopping just outside the circle of slaves. His voice, trained by years of military command, carried clearly across the field. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Mississippi, I order you to disperse immediately and return to your assigned workstations. Any who comply will be spared punishment. Any who resist will face the full consequences of their rebellion." The silence that followed was profound. Not a single slave moved from their position. Even the children, who might have been expected to flee in terror, remained steadfast beside their parents and elders. Grandmother Ruth, despite her advanced age, stepped forward to serve as spokesperson for the group. Her weathered voice carried a dignity that made even the hardened soldiers pause. "Colonel," she called out, her words clear and strong, "we ain't rebels, we ain't criminals. We're just people who have remembered what it means to be human, and human beings can't be owned." Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "You are property, legally purchased and owned by Mr. Blackwood. Your defiance is theft of his rightful assets." "Property don't pray," Ruth replied simply. "Property don't love, property don't hope. But we do all these things, which means we ain't property at all." The exchange was being heard not just by those present, but by riders who had come from neighboring plantations to witness the confrontation. Word of Ruth's simple but profound logic would spread throughout the territory, planting seeds of doubt in minds that had never questioned the fundamental assumptions of their society. Ezekiel and Elijah opened their eyes simultaneously, their gaze falling on Colonel Whitmore with an intensity that made his horse shy nervously. When they spoke, their voices carried across the field with supernatural clarity. "Colonel Whitmore," they said in perfect unison, "you come here with weapons and threats, believing that violence can overcome truth. But we ask you to consider, what happens when people discover they are more than what you have told them they are?" Whitmore's hand moved instinctively to his saber. "I don't engage in philosophical debates with property. You have 1 minute to disperse, or we will disperse you by force." The twins smiled sadly, their expression reflecting not fear, but pity for the man who could not see beyond his own limitations. "Then you must do what you believe you must do," Elijah said quietly. "But know that what you destroy here today will rise again, stronger than before, in places you cannot imagine." "The spirit cannot be killed," Ezekiel added, his voice carrying a certainty that made several of Whitmore's men shift uncomfortably. "And what we have awakened here will spread like fire across this land until every soul in bondage remembers their true nature." Dr. Pemberton, watching through his telescope, felt his scientific detachment crumbling as he observed the extraordinary calm displayed by the slaves. They showed no signs of panic or desperation. Instead, they seemed to radiate a peace that transcended their circumstances. Whitmore raised his hand, preparing to give the order to fire, when something unprecedented happened. Several of his own men lowered their rifles, their faces reflecting confusion and doubt. "Sir," called out a young soldier named Private Morrison, his voice trembling with uncertainty, "these people, they're not acting like rebels, they're acting like they're in church. They're acting like human beings," added Sergeant Williams, a veteran of Indian wars who had seen his share of violence. "Sir, I've fought enemies who wanted to kill me, but these people, they're just standing there, praying." Whitmore turned in his saddle, his face flushed with rage. "They are slaves in rebellion against their lawful owners. Your job is to follow orders, not to philosophize." But the damage was done. The simple humanity displayed by the slaves had created cracks in the certainty of the armed men surrounding them. Some continued to hold their weapons ready, but others began to lower them, their faces reflecting the internal struggle between duty and conscience. Blackwood, seeing his last hope for restoring order beginning to crumble, spurred his horse forward. "Shoot them!" he screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. "They're destroying everything. Shoot them all!" But before anyone could respond to his command, something extraordinary occurred. The twins, still standing hand in hand at the center of the gathering, began to glow with a soft golden light that seemed to emanate from within their very beings. Dr. Pemberton, his scientific instruments forgotten, stared in amazement as the phenomenon spread outward from the twins to encompass the entire gathering of slaves. The light was not harsh or blinding, but warm and comforting, like sunlight filtered through stained glass. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's no scientific explanation for this phenomenon." The effect on both the slaves and the armed men was immediate and profound. The slaves began to sing again, but this time their voices seemed to harmonize with the very air around them, creating a sound that was both earthly and divine. The soldiers, meanwhile, found themselves unable to maintain their aggressive postures in the presence of such overwhelming peace. Whitmore, his military training warring with the evidence of his own eyes, raised his pistol toward the twins. "Witchcraft!" he shouted. "This is devil's work!" But as he pulled the trigger, something impossible happened. The bullet, fired at point-blank range, simply stopped in mid-air, hanging suspended between the barrel of his gun and the twins' bodies. It hung there for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, then fell harmlessly to the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person present, slave and free, black and white, stared at the fallen bullet with expressions of awe and terror. Ezekiel and Elijah looked at Colonel Whitmore with expressions of infinite compassion. "Violence cannot overcome love," they said together, their voices somehow audible to everyone present, despite speaking barely above a whisper. "Hatred cannot defeat hope, and no earthly power can diminish the divine spark that lives within every human soul." The golden light surrounding the slaves began to pulse, and with each pulse, it seemed to reach out toward the armed men surrounding them. Several soldiers dropped their weapons entirely, falling to their knees as they were overwhelmed by a sense of peace they had never experienced before. Private Morrison was the first to speak, his young voice carrying clearly across the field. "Sir," he called out to Whitmore, "I can't do this. These aren't enemies. These are children of God." One by one, other soldiers began to lower their weapons, their faces reflecting the internal transformation taking place within their hearts. The simple humanity of the slaves, combined with the inexplicable phenomena surrounding the twins, had shattered their certainty about the righteousness of their cause. Whitmore, seeing his authority crumbling, made one final desperate attempt to restore order. "Any man who refuses to follow orders will be court-martialed for mutiny," he shouted. But his words fell on deaf ears. The soldiers were no longer listening to him. They were listening to something deeper, something that spoke to the fundamental nature of right and wrong. Sergeant Williams, a man who had followed orders without question for 20 years, stepped forward and laid his rifle on the ground. "Sir," he said quietly, "some orders can't be followed by men who want to keep their souls." The transformation was complete. What had begun as a military operation to suppress a slave rebellion had become a moment of spiritual awakening that transcended the boundaries of race, class, and authority. Dr. Pemberton, his scientific worldview forever altered by what he had witnessed, closed his journal and walked slowly toward the gathering of slaves. As he approached, the golden light seemed to welcome him, and he felt a peace he had never known before. Cornelius Blackwood, watching his world collapse around him, slumped in his saddle with the weight of defeat. His slaves were free, not because they had been given their freedom, but because they had remembered that freedom was their birthright. The twins, their mission complete, looked out over the transformed landscape of human hearts and souls. They had come to Blackwood Plantation as property, but they were leaving as catalysts for a change that would ripple across the continent. "Our work here is finished," Ezekiel said softly, his words somehow audible to everyone present. "But the work of freedom has only just begun," Elijah added, his voice carrying the promise of a future that none of them could fully imagine. As the golden light began to fade, the twins walked hand in hand toward the edge of the field, followed by the hundreds of slaves who had chosen freedom over security. Behind them, they left a plantation transformed, a group of soldiers who would never again be able to raise weapons against the innocent, and a doctor whose scientific understanding had been forever expanded by witnessing the power of the human spirit. The enigma of the divided soul had fulfilled its purpose, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire generations of those who sought freedom, justice, and the recognition of the fundamental dignity that exists within every human being. As the sun reached its zenith over the Mississippi Territory, the dawn of reckoning had given way to the bright light of a new day. A day when the impossible had become possible, and the human spirit had proven itself stronger than any force that sought to contain it. The twins disappeared into the morning mist, their story becoming legend, their impact echoing through history as a testament to the power of faith, love, and the unbreakable connection between souls who refuse to be diminished by the circumstances of their birth.